Hi, Carolyn. Oh, hi. Hi, Jim.
Hello, good to see you. Oh, Patty. Heather is here somewhere.
Yeah, I found her. I just wanted to say hi.
Okay, good.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. So welcome to everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here on a warm afternoon. And a welcome to family and friends who are joining us over the internet. We're live streaming the event for those who can't be here. So you should all behave, just remember. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting in the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations. This area, located in central Ontario and now known as the Haliburton Highlands, has always been called Kidaki by the Anishinaabe. We respectfully acknowledge that the Williams Treaties First Nations and the Algonquin Nation are the stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity. The intent and spirit of the treaties that form the legal basis of Canada bind us to share the land for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. My name is Carolyn Coburn, and I've been asked to open this event. Perhaps you figured that out already. And to speak briefly about how I've come to know Norm and Jim. Norm. My recollection is that he came to the county as the interim minister for the United Church pastoral charge of Minden, Carnarvon, and Maple Lake. I think that was in 2003. He persuaded us to form the Outreach Committee, which we didn't have at that time. The Outreach Committee, which is a going concern to this day. The next year, in 2004, when the provincial government announced the closure of the Frost Centre, there was a huge community outcry. For those of you from far away, the Frost Centre had been running for, I think, some 80 years, had been training foresters, and then Ministry of Natural Resources staff. It was a wonderful outreach In fact, I remember going there for a field trip from U of T biology class, quite a long time ago. Anyway, we were pretty upset, and the community rallied. Norm was part of that. We called our core group Permafrost, which I thought was brilliant. I don't think I can take the credit, but we thought it was a great name. At one point, Norm took on the chairmanship of Permafrost. And then there was the Children's Water Festival, and then there was the Friends of Ecological and Environmental Learning, and then there was the branch of the Toastmasters. I was asked to be brief, so there's more, but that gives you a flavor of just how involved Norm has gotten in our community. Norm is constantly looking for opportunities to contribute, to improve the quality of life in this community. He has an insatiable curiosity. We are frequently recommending books to one another, trying to understand the world, politics, history, religion, you name it. Norm is a storyteller. I'm not probably telling you anything you don't know on that front, with an amazing memory. When we visit, he often refers to his experiences in the various communities where he has lived and worked. Norm is a fast friend. I know this because whenever we visit, he often refers to friends he first knew many years ago, with whom he's recently spoken. Norm cares deeply about his families, the one he has here and the one out west, and about his friends. He shares our successes and our disappointments. Now, Jim. I've known Jim, that's him. I've known Jim even longer than I've known Norm. A year or so after I returned to the county in 1996, the women's shelter closed for lack of sustainable funding. A group of us met to consider alternatives to never-ending fundraising. Jim and I were in that group. One of the outcomes of those meetings was the creation of the Haliburton County Community Cooperative. The co-op has become a significant player in community development in the county. Jim is president and the liaison to several co-op projects, the ULINK Center for Community-Based Research, and Dusk Dances, now known as Dance Happens Here Haliburton. Most recently, the Haliburton Highlands Sports Hall of Fame held its inaugural event, another co-op project that Jim has been a part of. Jim has many talents. He's an artist, a consultant to the Haliburton County Community Development Corporation and the co-op, curator of the Haliburton Sculpture Forest, part-time faculty member at Fleming College, a facilitator, and more. I've seen Jim work in the community, and I've worked with him on the co-op board. I value his skills and his friendship. So you can see I'm pretty fond of these two. Community builders par excellence. I'm honored to be part of today's event to celebrate the completion of the book. It's a significant accomplishment to write a book, to stick at it for months and months. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jim, who will tell us more. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Carolyn. Were you blushing, Norm?
I have my mask.
Okay, yes. Fantastic. I've known Norm for a long time. You can read all about it in the book. But we were having lunch one day at the Dominion Hotel on the deck and just talking about things going on in the community and a number of different things. And we were there, and Norm and I have different thoughts about who was there at the meeting. Norm thinks Larry was there. I think it was Tom. But we do both agree that Patrick Walsh was there. And Norm, as he does, was telling a story about something that went on in his life which was salient to our conversation. And Patrick's jaw had dropped at that point and said, "Oh my goodness, Norm, you should really be getting these stories down in a book. Have you ever thought of writing a book?" And Norm said, "Well, I've thought about it, but that's a lot of work." And I piped up and said, "Hey, Norm, I'll help you with that if you want." 5 years later, here we are. Over to you, Norm. Take your mask off.
Yes, yes. Well, the question was, how do you talk about 90 years and put it in a book? And so I suggested to Jim, why don't we do it by decades? The dirty 30s, the fighting 40s, the fabulous 50s, the scintillating 60s, the sloppy 70s, and so on and so on. No, he said, that doesn't sound right. Well, I said, why don't we do it we'll go by social events and trace this. And then he said, well, what about your story? Well, I said, I'll just work my story in the decades and the social events and so on. So, okay, let's start. So we did start, and it was hit and miss a bit. But finally, Jim said, Norm, stick to the story. Tell your story, and I'll work in the rest. And so that's what we did. So what you have in your hands is a story of my life, my work, my friends, my family, and people who are important to me, and the challenges that I faced during 90 years of rich, rich living. I owe a lot to my parents, I know an awful lot to my kids, and I owe an awful lot to my friend James. So, on with the show. On with the show.
Norm and I hired a choreographer so that we could do this. Norm and I are going to read some different passages of the book. As Norm says, we started off sort of every second Thursday. Norm would arrive at my house with muffins and a Tim Hortons coffee. He didn't like my coffee, I don't think. My coffee was too strong for him. And we recorded his stories. We got about 20 hours of stories recorded, and then I got a young woman to actually do the transcription. And then we put that all together, and then we realized we had all sorts of holes and gaps and whatever, and spent the next 3 years filling those. So this book actually begins before Norm and begins with his parents in Cape Breton Island. My parents met in 1923 when my father was a student minister at the Methodist Church in Apsby Bay, Cape North. My mother had gone down to Cape North to look after an ailing aunt. The local Presbyterian minister happened to be laid up in hospital at the time. So my father, as a professional courtesy, was visiting the housebound Presbyterian parishioners as well as his own. Among them was my mother's aunt. My parents first laid eyes on each other when my father made this pastoral call. As my mother described, after that first visit, he made a number of calls that were not so pastoral. That fall, my father returned to his studies at Mount Allison University, and my mother returned to her teaching position in Sydney. In her journal, my mother noted, correspondence is not always a satisfying way to keep the spark alive. Somehow, they managed. In the summer of 1926, my father was assigned the student charge of Newton, New Brunswick, for the year. My parents had planned to get married the following summer after his ordination, but the sudden passing of my mother's mother caused them to change their plans. They were married in a quiet ceremony on September 14, 1926. For their honeymoon, they took a motor trip for 4 days to various places on Cape Breton Island, after which my father returned to Newton and my mother went back to teaching in Sydney. She resigned her position at Christmas and headed off to Newton with Pico, her Angora cat. My mother recalled her reunion with my father this way. I arrived in Newton on a cold, starry night in late December. Norm met me at the railway station in Sussex, which was 12 miles from Newton. We arrived at the manse, a cold, barn-like house, which I never did succeed in making home-like. Several of the ladies from the church were waiting for us. They had prepared a fine repast and welcomed me most cordially. And so my parents' partnership as wife and husband, minister and minister's wife, and lifelong soulmates began in earnest. Over to you, Norm.
I didn't do very well in grade 13. I didn't fail, but I got very poor marks. All I really wanted to do was play football and hockey. I never seemed to be able to settle down to do homework or study. I was only interested in sports. My father, on the other hand, wanted me to go to university. I decided to go back to school for another year to improve my marks. But after football season was over, I decided to quit. When I told my principal that I was leaving school, he said, "I'm sorry to see you drop out, Norm, but in all honesty, I think the standard of the school should improve after you're gone." He may have been joking, but his words stuck with me. So I got a job in the Bank of Nova Scotia. And 3 years later, I found myself in a place called Windsor, Ontario. One day in May of 1951, while out on a picnic down by the river, I was taken with an appendix operation. I ended up in the hospital and had my appendix removed. In those days, an appendix operation required a week's stay in the hospital and a week recuperating. While I was still in the hospital, Kirkpatrick, who was the manager of the YMCA, came to see how I was doing. He casually mentioned that maybe I could be thinking of going back to school. When I told him how poorly I had done in high school, he just said, "Well, that was then. This is now," and left it just as that, and left it to that. Later in the week, he showed up in my hospital room, accompanied by an older gentleman, and they proceeded to talk about my future. I told them I already had a future with Chrysler's. Kirk looked me in the eye and said, "That's good honest work, Norm, but I think you have talents that will go untapped if you spend your life working for Chrysler." The older man began to tell me about how some universities had a preliminary year for people like me, who had dropped out of high school. Kirk chimed in that the YMCA would sponsor me, providing tuition to get my degree, and they would have a job for me when I graduated. He thought I would make a great YMCA worker and suggested that I get a degree in social work. And as they left, the old gentleman turned around and said, "Think of it as a door, Norm." So there we are. 7 years later, I was finally ordained and educated and assigned to a place called Swastika in northern Ontario, just outside of Kirkland Lake. And I started my life as a United Church ordained minister. On our first night, rather than unpack, we simply went to bed. We were exhausted after having driven 400 miles to get there. Along about 3 a.m., I was awakened by a distant rumbling. As I lay there wondering what it might be, it came nearer and nearer. I was reminded of the line in that song, "The railroad goes through the middle of the house." But I wasn't worried yet. But as the rumbling got nearer and nearer, I became alarmed. Adele sat up in bed. "Can you hear that?" she asked. "Hear it, I can feel it." The house began to shake and shake. This went on for about 5 minutes, till we wondered if the house was going to break apart. Finally, the noise and shaking began to subside and then disappeared. The next day, we were told that a 40-car train loaded with iron ore would be coming from Larder Lake every morning at 3 a.m. We got used to it eventually. But when we had guests, we didn't tell them about the early morning train until after they had experienced it. One Sunday evening, 2 years later, I arrived home to be told by Adele that a man named Cliff something or other from Edmonton had called and wanted me to call back as soon as I got home. He introduced himself as Cliff Elliott, senior minister at Robertson Memorial United Church, which is now Robertson Wesley. I quickly realized he was the Cliff Elliott that I had met some years before in Hamilton. He told me, "I'm looking for an assistant to serve as our youth minister." And I've spoken to Art Craig in Waterloo, who said I couldn't go wrong with Norm Thomas. "How much do you pay?" I asked. $4,000 a year. "I'll come for 5,000, I said. "Norm, you come for 4,000. What you will get at Christmas time will more than make up the difference." So I went. And that Christmas, the board gave me a turkey.
I'm going to introduce Kirk now.
And the UCW gave me a turkey. And a funeral director gave me one. So we had one of the turkeys for Christmas dinner. But it wasn't all downhill. Because the house wasn't ready for us, and my family were not going to come for another couple of weeks. The Cliff Elliott and his family asked me to stay with them for a while. So I got to know their children. They had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. And one of the sons is Kirk, our fiddler. Where is he? He's changed a bit. He was 8 years old when I met Kirk. And his brother Stuart was 4. His sister Cherry would be about 14. And Gang Gracie was about 3 or 4. It was really something for me to be with that family. And we've stayed friends ever since. So Kirk is going to play you something, and I hope he's composed a piece just for me, and then he'll play something just for you.
So Norm asked me, do I know a piece that would absolutely reek of the Maritime?
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to play a Scottish march, which is very traditional. And it's lighthearted, but it has depth as well. And then I'm going to do a little subtle key change and play a piece called Norm's Jig, which I wrote specifically for Norm. I don't know the name of this jig, but it's very, very Cape Breton.
Well, after 6 years in Edmonton, I received a call to Toronto, to a place called Wood Green United Church. I was called to succeed a man who had been there for 33 years. But I should say I succeeded a legend. And people expected that I would carry on the same way as Ray had carried on. I had known Ray from my earlier days at Emmanuel College. He knew, and I knew he liked me and wanted me to succeed him. But I'm not really prepared for the continuous influence he would have on my work. For example, one day in early December, 3 weeks after I arrived, I received a call from one of the church board members. Norm, it's time to get the Christmas tree. What do I have to do? Well, Ray always called the manager at the exhibition grounds and got one for free. I called the manager at the CNE. May I speak to Mr. McNaughton, please? Mr. McNaughton is no longer here. He has retired. That's okay. Could I speak to the person who took his place? Yeah, George here. What can I do for you? My name is Norman Thomas, and I'm the minister of Wood Green United Church. Over the years, Mr. McNaughton provided us with a large tree and put lights on it using a cherry picker. Well, he's not here, and we don't do that sort of thing anymore. So I boarded a pickup truck and got a teenager to come with me to get the biggest tree we could find. The one we got was 22 feet tall. We got it for half price. We then had to put it up on the portico that ran the full length of the front of the church. We finally got it anchored and put lights on it. It looked pretty good. In January, at the next board meeting, I presented the bill for the tree. What's this bill for? The chair asked. It's the bill for the Christmas tree, I answered. You paid $11 for the Christmas tree? Yes, I said, we got it for half price. Ray could have got it for nothing.
He'll be back. Ray McCleary was an incredible legend, and if you go to the Leslieville neighborhood, you'll see the Ray McCleary Towers, Seniors Home, the Red Door Shelter, the Wood Green Community Center. Wood Green is now the largest provider of not-for-profit housing in Toronto, and that was all started by Ray McCleary and, of course, followed by Norm. My first Sunday in Wood Green was on Remembrance Sunday, November 6, 1966. That afternoon, the people in Donmount, a community a few blocks west of the church on the edge of the Don River, were protesting the demolition of their houses, which were to be replaced by a new urban housing development. After the service, some of us walked down to join the demonstration. That was my introduction to the concerns of the community. It is hard to believe how naive I was. I had just come from working with an upper middle class congregation in the West and arrived to what appeared to me to be a seedy place, full of grime, dust, dirt, and angry people. Even though I had eagerly made this choice, I was not mentally prepared for it. All the same, it reignited my interest in community organizing, which had been sparked by Russ Kempton when I was in Edmonton. Now, it took Norm a couple of years of getting to know the community and all the machinations that he needed to go through. But finally, he had brought together a group of ministers who had formed a new organization, and they got the funding to actually hire a community organizer. And this was in the person of Don Keating. And Don was somebody that Norm had known many years ago at a workshop in Saskatchewan, who had left the ministry and had gone to study under Saul Alinsky and his the people who worked with him about community organizing. When Don arrived in the spring of 1969, he began to ask questions that helped us understand the powerlessness of the poor. My short experience in the plunge had opened my eyes in a small way to this feeling of helplessness. Community organizing, Don explained to us, is an adversarial and often confrontational process that pits the community against the establishment. It is issue-oriented and designed to give people power. Shortly after Don arrived, I asked him, "What are you going to do?" "I will start visiting people and finding out firsthand what's bothering them," he replied. It didn't take him long to find an issue for people to rally around. He began to demonstrate through action how the poor could have power without politicians involved. When he started visiting homes on Grant Street, a short street running north from Queen, 1 block east of Broadview, Don found that many of the residents talked about issues with Sunnybrook meat packers. He heard similar comments from the people on Kintyre, which runs parallel to Queen, joining Broadview and Grant. Sunnybrook Meat Packers was a butcher shop and packing plant that had been in business on Queen Street East for 32 years. Their meat was butchered outside of the city and was taken by truck down the alleyway to the back of the plant, where it was cut up into pieces to be sold. Often the trucks would be backed up down the side street. The trucks would then be hosed down and the bloody water would run out into the street. In the summer, flies would gather around the water, and in the winter, children would go sliding down the bloody ice. As Don visited along Grant Street, he invited each household to a meeting. The people who helped organize were a bit disappointed that only 10 people showed up, but they forged ahead and identified a multitude of issues in the Grant Kintyre neighborhood. Don then explained the basics of mass-based community organizing, winning and building. Choose a problem you can win on. The results should affect a large number of people, be fairly visible, and be achieved in a relatively short period of time. They decided that the issues related to the meatpacking plant best fit these criteria, and they would take a direct approach and invite the owner, Sam Weisberg, to their next group meeting. They talked about the most effective methods of getting him to attend. They decided to write him a polite, formal letter with all of their names attached, inviting him to attend their group meeting to discuss some of the neighborhood issues that were of concern. The night of the meeting, Mr. Weisberg did not show up, but his son came as his representative. He told the group that his father was away on holidays for 2 weeks. He agreed to address some of the group's concerns, but there were other issues that he said only his father could commit to. The group set up another meeting in 3 weeks. On April 13th, when Mr. Weisberg would be back from holidays. Another invitation was sent by mail, and then a telegram on the evening of the 12th. But again, the owner failed to attend. Mass-based community organizing is about giving the power to the people who are affected by the issue and not being afraid of confrontation. The core of the Grant Kintyre group had already discussed what they might do if he didn't show. If he won't come to us, we will go to him. Don had brought a city map and had Weisberg's home address. About 20 people got into cars and drove to Weisberg's fancy house in Forest Hill. When he came to the door, he was surprised one of his customers was standing there along with her neighbors. He invited them in. "Now," he said, "what's this all about?" They read him a long list of their grievances. He told them that he had the right to do what he liked and proceeded to call the police. When the police arrived, the people explained that Sam had invited them in. After receiving confirmation from Sam that this was correct, the police left. Sam disappeared upstairs and left them standing there. What to do? The next day, they held a strategy meeting and decided that one of the residents, Ivy Samus, would park her car in the laneway behind her house, and block the trucks from going to the plant. Wiseman tried to get the police to tag the car and have it towed away, but the laneway was private property. He tried to get the neighboring business owners to have it declared a public lane, but they weren't willing to go up against their customers. Ivy moved her picnic table into the laneway. This became the group's office. After a 2-day standoff with no results, the group decided to picket in front of Weisberg's store on Thursday and Friday. Weisberg told the media that he wouldn't meet with a mob. In response, they reprinted the leaflet they were handing out on the street. This time, on the bottom of the page, they put, "For list of members, turn over." On the reverse side of the leaflet were the names of the 55 groups that had just formed the Riverdale Community Organization, of which Grant Kintyre was listed as a member, and of which Norm was the president. This was no mob. This was a highly organized community protest. By Saturday morning, Sam capitulated and met with the group at their office in the laneway. They drew up an agreement, which they all signed. He committed to making some pretty extensive improvements. The drains were fixed properly, and the alleyway at the back of the store was paved. He even put up basketball hoops so the kids could play. It was a resounding success. This action proved to the group that they were effective when they identified an issue that affected them and stayed together. They realized that they could make the kind of changes that made their community safer and healthier.
Well, after 8 years of this kind of thing, I was pretty well burned out. I decided to leave the ministry. And so I took my family out west to see our oldest daughter out in Edmonton. And on the way back, we stopped off at Jasper. And I was all washing my hands in the sink in the camping place beside a chap. I said, "Who are you?" I told him who I was. "What do you do?" "I'm a preacher." But I said, "I'm finished with that." And so we got talking. He said, "My home church is looking for a minister like you." And so I told him I was going to be staying with a friend, Doug Loughlin, in Edmonton. When I got to Calgary, Doug said, "This church wants to meet up with you." It was Scarborough United Church in Calgary. And after we met, they insisted that I come and be their minister. They talked about how depleted their membership was and how broke they were and all this sort of thing. But they said, "We have a strong congregation and you'll be just what we want." So, let me see here. So off I went. On this first Sunday, there were only 35 people in the pews. This is a church that would seat 700 people. I thought to myself, why on earth have I come here? The words of my friend Doug Loughlin came to me. "This is a diamond in the rough, Norm. You're just what they need." So I decided to start out by meeting with the members of the congregation. And a man named Elmer Flutterjohn, not a great name, Elmer Flutterjohn. He kept track of all the memberships. He let me know that there were 350 family units and 156 widows among the members. So I asked the board chair to put me in touch with somebody who was personable, got along with people, and was highly regarded in the congregation. Oh, he said, "You should talk to Marion Jorgensen." So I approached Marion and said, "I've been looking through our records, and I see that we have 36 church elders, and we have 36 elders' districts. Could you arrange for me to meet in each elder's home with the people in their district and do it all this fall?" So she organized all these meetings. We did this sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes in the evening. But over the 2.5 weeks in the afternoons and evenings, I went to meet with the members of the church in their elders' homes. I followed a Quaker model of welcoming new people to a gathering that I had learned at a workshop in Toronto. I asked them 4 questions. We started out with, "Tell me about the first 10 years of your life." And so we went around the circle and they told their stories. It turned out that very few of them had been born in Calgary. They'd been growing up in communities across the country. The next question was, how was your home heated? How was your home heated? The answer was wood, coal, oil, and so on. And then I asked, where was the center of human warmth in your family? Was it in a person, a place? And talked about that. And then I asked, when did God become more than a person to you as you grew older? These meetings were as full of insights for me as they were for those attending. Some of the congregation members were meeting others for the first time. Not only that, they were discovering something new about their neighbors and sharing something of their own stories as well. It was a very worthwhile investment in time for all of us. And it was a great experience, and they started coming to church. So then I was there for 11 years in Calgary with a variety of roles, but you'll have to read the book. So after 11 years, I accepted a call to Southminster in Lethbridge, Alberta, and Jim will tell you the big thing about that.
Norm and the United Church were involved in all sorts of different social issues as they came to Canada. And as Norm says, you'll have to read the book to find out about all of those things. But one of the major issues that came before the United Church was related to the ordination of the 2S LGBTQ plus individuals. And this section is called The Issue. In 1982, the United Church established a task group to study sexual orientation and the ministry. In 1984, they issued a report entitled Sexual Orientation and the Eligibility for the Order of Ministry, which stated that, in and of itself, sexual orientation should not be a factor determining membership in the Order of Ministry of the United Church of Canada. When the newspapers reported that the United Church was considering the ordination of self-declared homosexuals, it generated a lot of talk on the street. In the media and through the church, it was referred to as the issue. The talk among other denominations was also intense. Within the United Church itself, the conversation broke down between those who were in favor of ordaining openly gay ministers and those who were opposed. There were also many people who didn't know what to think, but you seldom heard from them. Those who were opposed were vehement in their opposition. Over time, the opposition within the church formed various groups, such as the UC Renewal Fellowship, the Community of Concern, and the National Alliance of Covenanting Congregations. They threatened to leave the denomination if the church made a decision in favor of this proposition. They were supported in their thinking by evangelicals, Roman Catholics, and the conservative-minded individuals. The response from church members across the country appeared to be overwhelmingly negative. The 1984 General Council of the United Church decided to postpone a decision until a subsequent meeting to allow time for further discussion. And the General Council of the United Church meets once every 4 years. They created the National Coordinating Group for the Program of Study and Dialogue on Sexual Orientation, Lifestyles, and Ministry, which led to the creation of hundreds of local discussion groups focused on the issue in churches across the country. These groups subsequently reported to the National Coordinating Group. It was a very tense time. Some ministers declined to express their opinions. Others became champions and outspoken supporters of inclusion and gay rights. In day-to-day life, members of the United Church were being accosted or teased at work and in public about the issue. The fact that the issue was left hanging and unresolved for another 4 years made it all the more diverse. In the spring of 1985, Albion Wright from the Special Projects Division of our national office invited a group of us who worked in special ministries to attend a 3-day event at Cedar Glen. During the first evening, a university chaplain asked if the group would be willing to spend part of an afternoon discussing the issue. We all agreed, since it was top of mind anyway. The next afternoon, the chaplain and 4 others identified themselves as part of the network of individuals who were preparing for the next General Council to be held in 1988. They explained that while the church had initiated a national coordinating group to study the issue, they were concerned that the negative response being strongly vocalized across the country was not likely to lead to a positive outcome. From this, Norm went back to Lethbridge. The Lethbridge conference, or the Alberta conference, they actually assisted congregations having discussions. And you can read in the book about how Norm and his congregation went about a quite phenomenal process to have this conversation that people were very uncomfortable with. These discussions laid the groundwork for acceptance of the ordination of homosexuals in our congregation, and they voted in favor. We were definitely in the minority across the country. About 90% of the reports from congregations were opposed. However, when the National Coordinating Group issued its final report in the early 1988, they recommended the church welcome sexually active adults, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people into all aspects of life and ministry of the church, and that the church develop liturgies celebrating their how do you say that word? Covenantal relationships. I can write it. The reaction to this report was explosive. A conservative group called Community of Concern was organized to oppose the report, and they issued a declaration of dissent. A poll taken by the church revealed that only 28% of the membership favored the admission of active homosexuals into the ministry. They took the issue forward to the 1988 General Council. The majority of delegates came to the council in August of 1988 with a bias against approving the recommendation. And the way the General Council works is there's one minister and one layperson from each congregation across the country. At the assembly, they heard heart-wrenching testimonials from devout gay and lesbian church members. For many of the delegates, this was probably the first time they had ever met someone who was openly gay. The delegates debated little else amongst themselves, and remarkably, most of them changed their minds. After a much heated debate, the General Council passed a resolution in favor of ordination, with a 3-to-1 vote in favor. From my perspective, this is Norm speaking, from my perspective, this was an incredibly positive step for the United Church. I was impressed that even though many of the delegates had come to the assembly with a negative bias, they had taken the time to really listen and were inspired by what they heard to change their minds. After the United Church approved the ordination of sexually active adults, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, there were a number of congregations that split up or lost their minister. There were a number of empty pulpits on Vancouver Island. I was asked if I would consider becoming the interim minister for Knox United in Parksville.
I should tell you that after the issue was passed, we lost membership on the Vancouver Island and in London, Ontario, and Ottawa. Apart from that, the national church wasn't affected too much. just as a matter of interest. But in the process, we lost 71 clergy who left our denomination, but most of them had come from other denominations and become accredited in our denomination. But they came because they thought we were so liberal that they'd be happier here. But the issue was too much for them. Anyway, I went to Parksville on Vancouver Island, and they had lost almost 90% of their congregation. And so I was asked if I would revitalize that congregation. I could have gone to Comox or Nanaimo, but I chose Parksville. I didn't know anything about it, but I was told that it was the tourist area of Canada, so I went. And then after I've been there for 3 years, I was asked to go across to Abbotsford. And I went to Abbotsford, and from there, I was there for 4 years. And from there, I was asked to go to Port Alberni for the same reason, and ended up doing 1 year at Ladysmith before I came here. But I want to tell you something. It seemed to me that I hit these churches just when there were parent-age adults with children who were looking for a church to attend. And so I came in response to their search for a church. And so we always had Sunday schools. And I had a great time with the children. I want to tell you about one of them. During the time I lived and worked in Abbotsford, I often had to go to the international airport in Vancouver. The most direct way to get there, although not always the fastest, was to go down south and follow Highway 10, which passed through a lush market gardening area. On one occasion, I was on my way to the airport to meet a plane that was due to arrive around supper time. As I passed by a large field, it looked at first like an orange-colored pond. Because of the traffic behind me, I was not able to stop and verify what must have been an optical illusion. I was not aware of any body of water near there. Thinking that I would stop on the way back, I went on to the airport. On my return trip, I watched carefully to see what it was that had caught my eye. It turned out to be a very large pumpkin farm. As far as the eye could see, there were pumpkins growing. I'm sure the field was 20 or 30 acres, just orange. But because of the setting sun had been in my eyes when I passed the first time, I'd only caught a glimpse of this magnificent spectacle. I stopped at the roadside. It was close to Thanksgiving, and I thought to myself, the children at the church would love to hear about this field of abundance. Taking one of the largest pumpkins I could find, I drove around to the nearest farmhouse, only to be told they were just renting the house, that the farmer who actually owned the pumpkins was away for the day. Although I felt a bit sheepish at taking the pumpkin, I thought the story of the huge field of pumpkins would impress everyone I told, and I would return at a later date and pay the farmer. That Sunday, during children's time, I launched into my story of how I had seen this strange colored pond and how it had turned out to be a huge field of pumpkins, of how I had taken the pumpkin to show them, of how I tried to pay for it, of how the farmer was away, and then, as if to emphasize the immensity of the whole experience, I grandly pointed to the pumpkin sitting on the communion table. I waited for only some response, but also for some affirmation of the effort I had made on their behalf to bring to them this magnificent specimen. There was a long silence. I waited until, finally, one little girl spoke up. "So you stole it." I could hardly believe my ears. After all that I had gone through to get that pumpkin, but it was no use. I stood condemned, a common thief in their eyes, and in the eyes of their parents, a disappointment. It got worse. After the church service, 2 of the teachers came to me. "The children are really upset, Norm. They think you did something wrong. You stole. Later in the week, I received an unsigned letter from a member of the church telling me how embarrassed she was to have a common thief as her minister, and that I should do the right thing and resign. One of my key leaders encouraged me to do something. 3 weeks later, I spoke to the children about the pumpkin. Kids, do you remember the pumpkin I showed you 3 weeks ago? You mean the one you stole? Well, yes, but I didn't actually steal it. I only borrowed it to show it to you. This week I stopped by the farmer's house and explained to him how you all wanted me to pay for it. I asked him how much he wanted for it. He told me, oh, never mind. If it was for the kids, you can have it for free. What do you think I asked? What do you think of that? I asked the kids. Well, you shouldn't have stolen the pumpkin in the first place. If these children have any influence with St. Peter, I'm definitely going to get a ticket through the gates of heaven.
I'm next. Or what do you got there?
No, you're next. You're next.
We have a lot of people to thank for this happening. And there's a long place of recognition in the book, a special recognition to Joan and Myra, our long-suffering partners, long-suffering for all sorts of reasons, but over 4 years hearing us go on
And on.
and on. And they were also our most fierce proofreaders. I think Joan might win the prize, but maybe not. Yes. A special thanks to Darlene Zelensky, who couldn't be here today, but Darlene was the editor for the book. She didn't edit the content, but she went through and edited all the conventions and the punctuation and did an extraordinary job. We also, when we got a sort of what we thought was a fairly good first draft, we gave it to a number of readers. Some of, like Carolyn was one who sent us all sorts of great comments, questions, continuity, dates. Carolyn is a great editor as well. And we also received lots of great feedback, which allowed us to move forward. And of course, special thanks to the folks at Parker Patent Printing. Mary Ann, who is the designer, who is just so patient and took the time. Mary and I have worked together on lots of projects, and she said, Jim, I know you're very particular, and so let's sit down and have a meeting about all the things, and then I will make like just a little section, and you can see, and then we can talk about it. And so she did it section by section, so we could get that feedback. And to Parker Patent Printing, who did such a beautiful job of printing this. Okay. As I listened to Norm's story unfold at my kitchen table, it felt at times I was hearing an extraordinary folktale, because at every turning point along his journey, from a very early age, someone would appear in his life to give him a sage piece of advice or offer a helping hand. Every time he was at a crossroads, someone opened a door. And Norm accepted the invitation, walked through, and headed off in a new direction and into another stage of his life. Some might call this kismet, but I know from spending lots of time with Norm that there is something special about him that engenders people's trust and draws them to him. As many of my friends who are here in the room and in the community have observed, you just can't say no to Norm. Putting this book together has been quite a journey. Just when I thought we had most of the story in place, Norm would make a casual comment about something, and after a bit of digging, I would discover a whole new chapter. The story grew wider and deeper and sent me scurrying after more background information. This process has taken me from the Protestant Reformation in Great Britain to coal mining the Protestant Reformation in Great Britain to coal mining in Cape Breton, from car manufacturing in Windsor to community activism in Toronto, from the oil boom in Alberta to the ordination of 2S LGBTQ plus ministers, from the creation of a UNESCO biosphere to the civil war in Nicaragua, and so much more. And in the course of all this, I found a wonderful friend.
You're such a crybaby.
Yeah. Let's see how you do. Let's see how you do, buddy.
Of incredible importance to me has been the relationship which I have with my children. I have 5 children, and they all live in the West. And so keeping in touch with them has been not a challenge, but a real joy, the way we've phoned and written and so on. But when they were young children and teens, most of my work involved high-demand congregations, and my time was not always my own. Adele, my wife, deserves a lot of credit for helping me stay connected with the kids. She kept track of my schedule and was incredibly talented at timing their availability to overlap with my free time. This could mean a bike ride in the park, a game of street hockey with the kids in the neighborhood, or taking the girls one at a time out for hot dogs. I remember that on those supper dates that some of them would get all dressed up. Wendy particularly would get up dressed up and wait for me to open the door to get in the car. Very, very, very distraught. When the girls were teenagers, we moved from central Calgary to the suburbs. We expected that Kathy and Wendy would switch to the high school near our house. But they were not having any of that. They had changed schools so often, as you can imagine. So every morning we piled into the car and drove downtown, dropping Nancy off at the bus stop to go to the university, and Wendy and Kathy to their high school. It was a great way for me to catch up on news. I spent time with Jeff, taking him to and coaching his hockey team. We spent a lot of 6 o'clock hours in the car in the bitter cold of Calgary. And I was fortunate to have a month's holidays every summer. We could spend time together at our cottage in Southampton, playing games, riding bikes, playing tennis, swimming, and just enjoying the long summer days. As I was reaching the end of my career as a minister, I began to think about retirement and where I might finally stop rolling and come to rest. I assumed I would go back to a place where I had been happy and where I had family and friends. But times change. I had accepted the invitation to come to Minden for a few months, and to my surprise, it became my permanent home. I became part of this vibrant community, and through Joan and her sons, Daniel and Luke, and subsequently their partners, Stephanie and Adela, I have found myself part of another wonderful family. I think back to the day 5 years ago, when Jim Blake opened yet another door as he told me that he would help me write the story of my life. It wasn't just his skill with words or the time he took to reshape what I had written. It was his unflagging enthusiasm that made this project possible. He believed that I had lived a remarkable life, and in the process of working with him, I began to realize that I really did have a story to tell. I've been given the opportunity to see my life in a deeper and more meaningful way. So thanks, Jim. Thanks for the time. Thanks for the challenge. And more importantly, thanks for being a great friend. But before I close, I want to tell you, we gave some books out this past week to some friends. I read your book, Norm. How'd you like it? I love the writing. How about the story? Well, yeah, but the writing. So after all that work, anyway, so my thanks to everyone, and a special thanks to everybody who's here. You've known me for, 20 some odd years, and it's been a joy for me to be here and to share my life with you. I hope you enjoy the book. Thanks.
Yes, Norma will be dancing the jig at the Golden Slipper tonight. There are more refreshments, thanks to Castle Antiques and our sponsor, Myra Stephen. And there are also, if you pre-ordered a book, they are here. And if you haven't, there are books for sale.
And when you're ready to leave, the back door is open, the front door is locked, just because the cafe's closed.
And Norm and I are available to sign your books if you so choose to have it marked that way. Well done.
Congratulations on finishing. Jim, thanks for being with my friend.
Oh, my pleasure, Laurie. Yeah.
Pleasure to be with him. I'm glad you're starting in with John.
Oh well, we're just chatting at this
Yeah,
point.
I
Just
was
chatting.
Jim, that was very touching.
Absolutely.
Yes. Can I ask you to sign this?
I think I have a pen in my pocket. I lost my mask somewhere. Here it is. You're in this, Joan.
I am?
You are indeed.
Oh my goodness.